Hi, everyone. So glad to see you all. Thank you for coming. And thank you for masking for this event. It's going to be easier on our guests. I'm Chris Kleindienst. I own Left Bank Books, or it's me, I'm not sure which. And I'm really thrilled to be hosting this event tonight. I want to welcome our virtual viewers online and remind them that when we get to the question and answer session, please feel free to be typing some questions in the chat because we're open to our virtual guests as well as our in-person guests. So briefly, Left Bank Books always has incredible events coming up all the time. And the best way to find out about them is to subscribe to our eBlast calendar, which you can do by logging onto our website. I'll mention one of them that's coming up this Thursday. It's a reading sponsored by a group called Kimbilio. Kimbilio means safe haven in Swahili, and the organization is a community of writers and scholars committed to developing, empowering, and sustaining fiction writers from the African diaspora and their stories. And it is run by the wonderful David Haynes, who will be here Thursday with novelist Jennifer Maritza McCauley and Janelle Williams. So we're pretty excited about that. Tonight's event is a joint effort of the WashU Women's and Gender Studies Department and the Left Bank Books Foundation's Joyce Treblecott Fund. We're so pleased to work with WashU on this project. Our Joyce Treblecott Fund was made possible by a donation from Joyce's estate and supports events with lesbian authors. And if you don't know, Joyce was the professor of philosophy at WashU and helped start what was then called the Women's Studies program. I majored in English and Women's Studies at WashU way back then, so I'm really happy that we're kind of closing this circle. It's really special to me. And of course, additional support comes from you, the community, when you buy the books of the authors we host, supporting both the author's work and your own locally owned bookstore. The kind of event that we put together with Sarah Schulman doesn't just happen in corporate capitalism. It takes the community. Yeah, I said those words. It takes a community bookstore with a relationship with its local university. It takes intention to build community and create space for public conversations. It's really kind of at the core of why I do this work. With WashU support, we're able to bring Sarah to speak to the university students, but also to host a community event in a community space that is non-academic and open to everyone, including our Kat Orleans, who is now going to photobomb the event. So, okay, I'm super thrilled to welcome Sarah Schulman to St. Louis. She has probably written half of her 19 award-winning published novels, plays, and books of nonfiction in the time it has taken for me to pull this off. For real. Sarah is one of the most talented and intelligent thinkers and activists of our time. She's currently the Rala Klepak Chair in Creative Writing, Nonfiction at Northwestern University. 17 page, no, I'll agree. She curates the First Monday Reading Series at the Performance Space New York. She's on the board of RAIA, Research of the American Israeli Alliance, Research On. She's on advisory board for the Jewish Voice for Peace. She's a fellow at the New York Institute for the Humanities at New York University, etc., etc., etc. Oh my God, everything. She also teaches writing every summer at the Provincetown Arts Center, and I was really fortunate to get to take her class last summer. Fills up pretty quick. She is, of course, the author of Let the Record Show, Political History of ACT UP, and that's what she's going to be talking about tonight. And there will be time after the formal remarks for questions, and she'll, of course, sign books. And for those of you virtually, if you want to sign a book, we will have, while supplies last, signed copies available online in the store. So please welcome Sarah Schulman.
Thank you so much, Chris. We've been in the same community for many, many years, and it's wonderful to be here at this fantastic store. Thank you everyone for coming. So AIDS is about 100 years old, and we know that it was in the United States in the 1940s, and we know that it was in New York City in the 1960s. But science did not notice the pattern that came to be called AIDS until 1981. And this is because we don't have a functional healthcare delivery system. So we know from people who worked with homeless people in New York in the 60s and 70s that they already had vocabulary words for AIDS symptoms. For example, they talked about junkie pneumonia, which we now know was pneumocystis pneumonia, or the dropsies, which we later called wasting syndrome, when people with AIDS could not process nutrition. So AIDS was so well known in the underclass that there was vocabulary for it, and yet science hadn't noticed it. It's not until the New York Times famous article, July 3rd, 1981, 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals in San Francisco, that this phenomenon was announced to the public. Now, I just want to explain to you what that headline means. Today, white gay man is by many considered to be a privileged category. But in 1981, this was not the case. Homosexual sex was illegal. Sodomy laws were not overturned until what year? Does anyone know? 2003. Right. And even in New York City, there was no anti-discrimination bills or any kind of protection. So at that time, you could be fired from your job for being gay, you could be kicked out of your apartment. There also was no right to public accommodation. So gay people could be denied service in a restaurant or in a hotel. Familial homophobia was the cultural norm and was virulent. And street violence by both the police and straight people was like a public form of entertainment called gay bashing. So we're talking about a highly oppressed minority. But there's more, because when people are stigmatized, they get investigated in a way that people who are considered normal are not. So there was an obsession with trying to find out the cause of homosexuality. Now today we know that sexuality and gender are different in each person and that they can change over your lifetime. But at that time, that was not known. And there was an assumption that people were born cis and straight, and something went wrong. And that wrongness was being, at that time, attributed to a biological cause. And there were gay scientists who were people like Dean Hamer, if you ever look him up, who were claiming that there was a biological cause to homosexuality, which they saw as one thing. And some of these claims were things like it was attached to your hypothalamus gland. There was actually coverage of this research in the New York Times. Now we know it's pseudoscience, but at that time it was taken seriously. So when the Times said 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals in San Francisco, what they were really saying was the biological disease of homosexuality itself is what you're seeing. And the very first name for this disease was GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Now, there's no such thing as gay-related immune deficiency because there's no biomarker for queerness, right? But that was that fantasy projected. And then the term gay cancer. There's no such thing as gay cancer. Cancer cannot be gay. It shows you what the mindset was. And so from the very first day, AIDS has been misrepresented and continues to be misrepresented. Now, the first 5 or 6 years after science understood that AIDS existed, 40,000 people died in this country. And the government did absolutely nothing. And pharma did nothing. All they did was they owned patents to various failed cancer drugs and they tried to recycle them. Because the concept at the beginning was to try to find the pill that you would take that would make your AIDS go away, and then they would make a huge amount of profit because it was an incredible market. The problem is that AIDS is an umbrella term like cancer, right? It's different in each person. What it means is that your immune system is not working, it's breaking down. So as it breaks down, people would get these horrible symptoms, which were called opportunistic infections. So like very young people would become blind or demented or get this skin cancer that would eat up their face, or you couldn't process nutrition and people had this horrible diarrhea and the nerves on your legs would swell up and you couldn't walk. It was a really horrible death. People suffered terribly. And pharma didn't care. They just kept going through these recycled cancer drugs. What the gay community was doing in those first 5 or 6 years was trying to create some facsimile of social services. And this is where familial homophobia comes in, which is a great force of history that is under-examined. Because normally, if their person has any kind of family and something goes wrong, there's some kind of support network, right? But here we had large numbers of people who had no support networks at all, who were in cities alone. And so the gay community was trying to create some kind of social service. So if you look in the early years, you can see things like gay men's health crisis. There was a Puerto Rican social worker there named Diego Lopez, who died of AIDS, by the way. And he started this thing called the buddy system. You would volunteer and you'd be assigned a person with AIDS and you would just like hang out with them or like help them do their laundry or something until they died, basically. Then there was a group that would walk your dog, which sounds like a weird thing, but I mean, if you're really sick, you want your pet, so they would help people keep their pets. Or there was a group called God's Love We Deliver, and they would bring free meals to homebound people with AIDS. So that's really what the gay community was involved in, and a lot of it was volunteer-based. But 1986, the Supreme Court did something very dramatic. In the Bowers v. Hardwick decision, they decided in the middle of a mass death experience that they were going to uphold the sodomy law. And this was really the turning point in the gay community's response to AIDS, because people were enraged. And there were angry demonstrations in New York and Washington without permits. And this is really when a different level of politicization started to set in. Right before ACT UP was founded, there were two kinds of little things that showed the politicization that was coming. One was a graphics collective made a poster of a black background with a pink triangle that said "Silence equals death," and they put it up all over New York City. And then this group called the Lavender Hill Mob that was a ZAP action group. ZAPs were a strategy of the gay liberation movement, the previous movement. They dressed up in concentration camp uniforms and burst into a meeting of the CDC. So those were like the two kind of things that sort of told you that this movement was coming, that was going to be very visually sophisticated and was going to fuck up everything. And then on March 10th of 1987, the writer Larry Kramer gave a speech at the Gay and Lesbian Center, and people in the audience decided that they wanted to start a group. And a few days later, they met again, and then the following week, they came up with the name ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Now, where I fit into this is that in 1979, at age 21, I dropped out of the University of Chicago. I came back to New York, and I became a journalist in the feminist and gay press. At that time, every city had a feminist newspaper and a gay newspaper, and some had more than one of each. And there was this whole cadre of gay journalists and feminist journalists all over the country who worked for free, who were out there, finding out what our issues were and reporting, because the mainstream media didn't even mention us. We were completely ignored. So it was a parallel world. And 79 is a really important year because abortion had become legal in 73. But in 79, the Hyde Amendment was passed that took away Medicaid funding for abortion. So except for the 7 states that provided their own Medicaid funding, after 79, if you didn't have the money, you couldn't get an abortion. So we really only ever had real abortion rights from 73 to 79. So that's a big turning point. And then 80 is ground zero because that's when Ronald Reagan got elected. And that's the beginning of all the problems that we're having now, right? So it's when the greedy capitalist Republicans decided to make a coalition with the evangelicals, and they thought they could control them. Ha! And history shows us that when industrialists try to make coalitions with fascists, they always lose control. And that's what happened there. So those are really key years for where we are today. So when I was already on the beat of these newspapers and I started covering AIDS in 82 and 83. And some of the stories that I covered were pediatric AIDS, which was huge in New York. Today, if a HIV positive woman is pregnant, there are medicines that she can take so that her child will be born negative. So no children are born positive in the United States now. But at the time, a lot of women didn't know they were HIV positive until their kids were born. And a lot of these women were poor, women of color, and their kids, they felt very guilty towards these infants, right? So science was putting HIV positive infants into what's called a double-blind study, which means only half get the medicine, the other half get a placebo, like the sugar, get sugar. And I covered this. My view was that no infant can consent to this. And if you look at it, I had come out of the reproductive rights movement of the 70s, so I had a patient-centered politic, and I looked at the issue from the point of view of people with AIDS, which included infants. And if you're a person with AIDS, you don't want that sugar, right? You want that medicine. So I objected to this. But there was a fight because science wanted clean data. So this was one of the earliest issues that I covered. I also covered women being excluded from experimental drug trials, and we're going to get to that in a minute. And I also covered homeless people with AIDS. And so from the beginning, AIDS was about social justice, from the beginning. And the New York Times wouldn't say the word gay. We used to call them the New York crimes. We hated them so much. Their coverage was terrible. And in fact, do you guys know what a fax machine is? Okay. When they got their first fax machine, we faxed them a mile of black paper. Just to let them know how much we hated them. So it was only the queer presses that were covering this with any kind of intelligence at the time. So in the 6 years that I cover in my book, 87 to 93, ACT UP won incredible victories, and I just want to summarize for you what some of them were. So ACT UP forced the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to change the way that they got drugs approved so that people who were very sick could get access to experimental treatments instead of having to wait for 4 or 5 years. They'd be dead, right? And the way they did it was people in ACT UP who had no policy background and no medical background, like a playwright actually was the guy who figured this one out. He just studied the FDA, figured out how they worked, designed something called parallel track to show a way that they could make these drugs available. Then they presented it to the FDA, and they said no. And then ACT UP organized this incredible action at the FDA. Now, in those days, the left used to either go to the White House or the Capitol, the White House or the Capitol. But this was different. ACT UP was like, let's not treat this symbolically. Let's go to the actual place that is opposing us. So they did the action in this weird suburb of Rockville, Maryland, right, at this building. And it was the first national action because by this time, other chapters had already started around the country. So people with AIDS came from all around the country. And then there was this brilliant media strategy that was devised by Urvashi Bad, our friend who just passed away, unfortunately, who was a great leader in this movement, and Mike Signorelli, who had worked for People magazine, but was now the head of the media committee in ACT UP. So what they did was they got all the newspaper reporters who had come from around the country, and they were like, person with AIDS from Dallas in this corner. And then the guy from the Dallas paper would go and interview him. And they match people up with local people. So the next day, all of these papers had front page stories about locals with AIDS. And that's how they got the national coverage. And the FDA agreed, and parallel track came in. So that was a huge victory. The second was that ACT UP ran a 4-year campaign to force the CDC to change their policies about women with AIDS. There were 2 big problems for women with AIDS who, in general, tended to be poorer, right, and didn't have access to good health care. And also women tend to get diagnosed in a more advanced stage of a disease than men because they're always taking care of other people. And also they don't have the money for good health care. So there were a lot of problems there, but there were also systemic problems. And one was that there was an official definition of what symptoms you had to get an AIDS diagnosis in order to get benefits. And it was only symptoms that men had. Women had different symptoms and they weren't on the list. So women couldn't qualify. So women would literally die of AIDS and never get an AIDS diagnosis, and they couldn't get any benefits. But the other issue was that in the 1960s, there was this drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women, and a lot of them had kids that were born without limbs. And they sued pharma, and they got a big settlement. So pharma said, okay, no more women in experimental drug trials. So women literally were not allowed in experimental drug trials. So if there's no treatment, that's the only treatment. So women could not get treatment. And ACT UP ran a 4-year campaign that changed this and got benefits for women and got women into trials. Now, in many ways, this is ACT UP's most far-reaching victory, because today, any woman with HIV in the world who takes a medication is taking something that was tested on women because of this change. It's also one of the greatest victories for women won by a predominantly male organization. So it's very significant on 2 fronts. Another great victory that ACT UP won was they got needle exchange in New York City. And this is also very interesting because at the time, harm reduction was a brand new idea. The main thing that was being put out for addiction was abstinence. And ACT UP was really into harm reduction because we were so advanced, you know. But the mayor at that time, David Dinkins, he did not support needle exchange. So the Needle Exchange Committee, which was active and former drug users inside ACT UP, decided to do something high risk. Strange, right? Addicts doing something risky. Well, that just completely fit. So they deliberately, illegally exchanged needles in order to get arrested so that they could have a test case. And what if they had lost, but they won? And needle exchange became legal in New York. Another great victory of ACT UP was that they took on the Catholic Church. And this was at a time before the priest-sex scandal. So the Catholic Church had incredible power. And in New York, the cardinal was more powerful than the mayor. And he was in office longer. And usually the Catholic Church would stay in their lane with the Catholic schools, but when there was a proposal to distribute condoms in the public schools, they went and got on the public school boards to try to stop this. So ACT UP felt that people would die because of this policy. And we decided that we were going to disrupt Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral to protest this. Now you have to think back, this is December 1989. Homosexuals with AIDS disrupting Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Oh, that's my phone, excuse me. So let me just turn this off.
It's a cardinal.
It's a cardinal, that's right. So ACT UP was mostly like a Jewish and Catholic organization because this is pre-gentrification New York and we all screamed at each other all the time, like it was very confrontational. But there were some Protestants in ACT UP and they were very concerned that this action would be seen as anti-Catholic. The Jews and the Catholics really didn't care about that. The Protestants did. So we agreed that we would do a silent die-in during Mass, right? So we all go into the church. There was a demonstration outside of about 7,000 people. And a bunch of us went in. I went into the church and we were going to do a silent die-in. But this one guy, Michael Petrellis, got really mad at the cardinal and he jumped up on the pew and he blew this whistle and he started screaming in his New Jersey accent, "You're killing us, you're killing us, stop it, stop it." And there was like total chaos. And there were police and dogs and people screaming and people throwing things and 100 people got arrested. It was like all of that. And later when I interviewed him, I asked him why he did that. And he said that he was mad because no one would let him be in their affinity group. Things happen for arbitrary human reasons. So when that happened, I thought, oh no, this is so terrible, because we had agreed to do it one way and now this other thing. Anyway, it turned out to be the best thing we ever did because the story was so huge. It was on the front page of every newspaper in the world. I mean, in Turkey, it was on the front page. And it really changed the way that ACT UP was viewed. They were afraid of us after that. And I did an interview with a photojournalist who told me that she could not, when she was selling photos to magazines, they always wanted like emaciated, helpless men with AIDS dying in their beds. But after Stop the Church action, they wanted people with AIDS fighting for their lives. So it really changed representation. So all of those things, but I think really overall, ACT UP changed the way that queer people and people with AIDS felt about ourselves and the ways that we were seen in the world. So these are very significant victories. I would say that ACT UP is one of the most effective social movements, in the 20th century, maybe in American history, right up there with some other really significant movements. And I just want to summarize a little bit how they did it. And this was something that Jim Hubbard and I have analyzed. We interviewed 188 surviving members of ACT UP over 18 years. And if you go to our website, which is actuporalhistory.org, you can watch all the interviews, you can download the transcripts. We also have 300 hours of archival footage. We've had 14 million hits on our website. So 2 people can do a lot. So I think that the first thing to really understand about what made them so effective is that they were not a consensus-based movement. You did not have to agree to go forward. So there was only a one-line statement of unity. It was direct action to end the AIDS crisis. That was it. And if you agreed with that, you could be in ACT UP. And all that meant was that it was direct action, not social service provision. So let's say you had a proposal and I thought it was terrible. We would yell and scream at each other in the meeting. And then you would just do it. But in the end, if I disagreed with you, I wouldn't try to stop you from doing it. I just wouldn't do it. And then while you were doing it, I would get my 5 people to do my thing. So this kind of radical democracy structure allowed for a simultaneity of response, where there were so many different kinds of actions, kinds of aesthetics, different strategic approaches aimed at different social milieu, all happening at the same time. That is actually what produced the paradigm shift. And I think it's really clear from studying this that movements that try to force everybody to agree on one analysis or one strategy always fail, and I don't think there's an exception, because people are different. I know it's like the hardest thing in life to accept. I've been in therapy for decades. But the truth is, people can only be where they're at, So if you really have leadership, what leadership does is that it helps people be effective from where they're at, instead of running around trying to force people to take positions that they are not really their positions. And movements need all different kinds of people. People don't have to do the same thing. I remember there was a girl who worked in a Xerox store, and her thing that she did for ACT UP was that she would let us come in the middle of the night and make illegal Xeroxes, for free. And that was what she did. But the organization was organized enough to be able to facilitate her doing that and helping us in that way. I think one of the reasons that it had this radical democracy was because everything was driven by the needs of people with AIDS, and people with AIDS didn't have time. So they couldn't be bureaucracy. There couldn't be big theoretical debates. People needed, so remember I was talking about these opportunistic infections that people had. They needed treatments for these infections. And pharma didn't want to do that because the markets were smaller, right? So it would hurt their profits. So we had to force science and force pharma to change the way they did research to get the treatments that people with AIDS needed. And so for that reason, ACT UP had no theory. There was no theoretical discussion. There were not study groups. There was nothing like that. It was action-oriented. One of the leaders, Maxine Wolf, said that when you go action first, your theory will emerge, because you have to decide how you're going to do your action. And so the questions come up that are real and applicable, and that's how you cohere your values, by going action first. And that's how ACT UP went. So those were some of the reasons it was so effective. Another thing that's really interesting is that ACT UP was primarily a white gay male organization, but there were participation by women and people of color, especially Latinos. This was a time when there were fascist dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, and there were a lot of people who had been university students or whatever who were in exile. Also, people who'd been in the Mexico City student movement of the late 1960s. So Latinos and lesbians were coming from previous movements and had more sophistication and savvy about how to do political things. The older white gay men came from the gay liberation movement, but the younger guys had not been politically active. So the women and people of color had an impact that was much larger than their size. And one of the reasons was that they did not stop the action to tell people to do like consciousness raising on racism or sexism. And ACT UP was racist and sexist like any white male organization would be. But instead of like trying to micromanage everything, because the truth is, you can spend your whole life trying to change one person and fail. Instead of doing that, these groups had they kept their eyes on the prize, and they knew what they wanted to win for their constituencies. So they would try to be effective. So for example, ACT UP had an art auction that raised $650,000. So there was a lot of money in the organization. So when the Latino caucus saw that people with AIDS in Puerto Rico had no support, they went to fundraising, got the money, went to Puerto Rico and started ACT UP Puerto Rico. When women with AIDS needed to go and testify at a hearing or something like that, and they needed travel money and they needed hotels, because don't forget, a lot of people were sick. We didn't have to raise the money. We just went to fundraising and got the money. So instead of trying to control everybody else, we took the ample resources of this community and used it to win things for our constituencies. And I think that that's a good lesson to remember. So anyway, that's sort of my introduction. I could go on forever. The book is 700 pages and I could talk twice as long. But I do want to hear what you're interested in focusing on, and thank you so much for coming tonight. Any questions or comments? Yes.
Are you aware that there's a case study where actually in the 60s, here in St. Louis, there was a young, I think a 15-year-old male who retroactively once was diagnosed, and when they did the medical, much later, that he actually had AIDS.
I think his name was Robert Radford or something like that. Yeah. But there are cases from the 1940s. So there was a bunch of sailors who died of a strange lung disease, and they saved lung cells and later found out it was pneumocystis pneumonia. So yeah, I mean, even today, we use this phrase HIV/AIDS, but actually HIV and AIDS are two different things. And the people who die of AIDS in this country right now are underclass people. People who end up, by the time they're in the emergency room, it's too late because they don't have any health care. And HIV now, in a way, you can hide HIV, but you can't hide AIDS. So the fact that we've kind of merged them into this one word is it's kind of like Judeo-Christian, they're actually two different things. But yeah, so there was many people had AIDS one scientist told Linda Villarosa, and if you don't know her work, she is like the expert on Black people and AIDS, and she's written these incredible pieces in the New York Times recently on Black gay men in the US South. And she interviewed a doctor who said that by the time that article came out on July 3rd, 1981, 200,000 people were already infected in this country. Because don't forget, there was no HIV test for a while. Yeah.
When did that happen? I'm sorry.
The HIV test?
Yeah.
I think it was 2 years into, do you know? I think it's like 83, I'm not sure. Other questions or thoughts?
May I
Yeah.
also ask, I'm sorry, I actually have to run, I really wish I could say the whole thing, but just in terms of one documentary media presentation that in your experience really captures the energy.
Yeah, that would be United in Anger by Jim Hubbard, which you can watch for free on Canopy or YouTube. Yeah.
There were some other hands, I think.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm just thinking about the current moment and politically for queer people and with abortion, medicine, everything. And so I come from like a generation where my queer activism was like against the mainstream gay rights movement, right? That was like the only enemy we had when I was like in my early 20s on the left, right? And I mean, it wasn't, but that was the only one we
It's a
liked.
lot easier. Yeah.
Right? It was like what we did, right? Was like, and you see, I feel like we're in this moment where it's like we really have to step up and fight the system and fight fascism. And I feel like there's something not there, or like I feel unprepared, despite yours in many different movements, for the moment, and I just wonder what your thoughts are.
Okay, I'm gonna answer you, but I don't have the answer. Let's just start with that. But the first thing about the more conservative gay groups, I mean, the further to the left is, the more credibility the center has. And when the left moves to the right, the center moves to the right. So the left really makes the center more palatable. I mean, I know that that's hard to live with, but the most radical left is not going to win exactly their agenda. So you have to think of it as it's all dynamic. And even if you hate those people, you are in a coalition with them because you're moving the needle. Like right now, every community in this country is under attack, right? So if people are going to work together, you have to understand that you're not going to agree on everything. If your idea is that you can only work with people with whom you agree on everything, forget it. It's not going to work because the communities are too different. So, let's say, for example, I'm very strongly pro-abortion rights, right? And I oppose the Catholic Church. Sometimes the Catholic Church does good stuff. Sometimes they're involved in anti-eviction stuff, So I'm not going to say I'm not going to work with you on this eviction case in my neighborhood because you're anti-abortion. I'm not going to do that. So you have to be able to work with people when you have agreement, and when you don't, leave them alone and do your own thing. And it takes a certain kind of maturity. But right now we're in a moment where, if you say the wrong word, you're the devil, and that's not going to work. So I think we need to learn from this big tent politic idea that you're going to have to learn how to get along with people you don't agree with. Yeah.
When you were doing your research for this book and conducting interviews, was there something that made you rethink something or change your mind or challenge your assumptions from when you were involved? Yeah.
So ACT UP, there was no internet, right? It's pre-internet, which means the way you found out something was you went into a room and someone was there and they told you. So a lot of people, including myself and Jim Hubbard, my collaborator, we thought that what we and our friends did was ACT UP, and everyone thought that. When I started interviewing people, everyone thought that they were the center of the organization, and because there was no place to check in and find out what was going on. So as we started piecing together what actually occurred, there was no timeline. Nobody had written a structure of the organization. We had to figure it all out. And everything was a surprise. I found out about entire campaigns that I had never known happened. For example, when President Aristide in Haiti was overthrown by a coup and there was a huge migration to the US, well, the US government doesn't want Black immigrants, right? So they tested all these Haitian people who had found out that they were positive. A lot of these people had never been to a doctor before. And they incarcerated them in Guantanamo. So now Guantanamo is, for Muslim political prisoners, but it used to be for HIV positive Haitians. So apparently ACT UP was involved in a underground kind of railroad for the Haitians from Guantanamo, trying to get them housing in New York City. I never heard of that until I interviewed people.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, first of all, this is fascinating. I can't wait to read it, but your introduction is just off the chain. You go up until 1993, and in the mid to late 90s, there was a shift, at least in public representation and research, that the HIV/AIDS have become now at least represented as a Black gay disease. And I think we are still dealing with that now, and particularly in certain places in the country, the South, where Black gay men, a CDC study determined that 1 out of every 2 Black gay men will be infected with HIV by their lifetime, as opposed to 1 in 10, I think, White gay men. And so I want to get your, beyond 1993, what are your thoughts about the politics, what we might call the politics of HIV/AIDS, particularly the racial and gender politics of HIV/AIDS, because we now have an increase in Black women, Black heterosexual women infected with HIV.
It's like a 5-hour answer. So let me say a couple of things. I think that the marriage campaign separated AIDS and gay, really, in terms of white people. So when you analyze those posters of like, I don't know if you remember this, but when for the gay marriage campaign, they would say like, we've been together for 40 years, why can't we get married? None of those people are identified as HIV positive. Many of them are. So the message was, gay marriage is going to be the cure for AIDS because gay marriage is going to change gay male sexual culture and they're going to be monogamous, and it's implied, right? And AIDS is this other thing. So that made a big separation. The separation of gay and AIDS was huge. I know that you are aware of this, but I'm just going to say there was a study that was done under the Obama administration. Why is there such a high rate among Black gay men? And what they found was that Black gay men actually complied with safe sex at a higher rate than white gay men did. It's just that Black men wanted to have Black partners, and so the pool of people had a higher rate of infection. But for years, if you look at the safe sex campaigns that are on the New York City subway and stuff, it acts like men of color don't know how to have safe sex. But the Obama administration found out that that's not true. So that reinforced a lot of false things. Now, in terms of women of color, PrEP, okay, so I have a few things to say about PrEP. Of course, I support PrEP. But, if we had a functional healthcare system and everyone who was HIV positive got the standard of care, they would all be virally suppressed. So the need for PrEP would be much less. So the profit margin of Gilead, the biblically named company that makes PrEP, is dependent on there being no healthcare delivery so that people continue to get infected and are not virally suppressed. But women are not being given PrEP. Women don't even know what PrEP is. I just saw an ad on TV for a PrEP, some form of PrEP, and it said, this has never been tested on people who are assigned female at birth. And I thought, okay, first of all, why has it never been tested instead of putting it in the ad? But also, a lot of cis women don't know that assigned female at birth means them. So if you're trying to tell them that this drug has never been tested, that's not the way to tell them. So PrEP's out of touchness with women is incredible. And also women are not supposed to be prepared. Right? So there's also PEP, which is the day after, which would work much better for women psychologically. But they did it on the gay male model, which is the way they do everything. So that's.
And it's not as widely advertised. Like, most people don't even know what PEP is.
Yeah, no.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah, et cetera.
Et cetera.
I have a question from here, a couple actually, but
Okay.
one is, what do you think ACT UP would do in response to the current legislative attacks on trans people and medicine? What should we be modeling from ACT UP to be more effective in this fight?
Okay, let me lay it out in a bigger way. Okay, this is a long answer, so be prepared. So when I started writing the book, I thought, I'm going to reread Martin Luther King's 1964 letter from Birmingham jail. And I'm reading it, and I'm like, oh my God, this is exactly what ACT UP did. I was like, wow, somehow we did exactly his plan. Now I have a theory about why. Most people in ACT UP were born in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And there was no concept of like gay youth. That didn't exist as an idea. So we didn't think, I'm going to grow up and run away to San Francisco. We thought like, oh shit. But you turn on the TV and there's Black people in revolt, right? And they're doing nonviolent civil disobedience. They're standing up to the police. They're being arrested. And all the tactics that ACT UP used. And I think we internalized the identification with that. I can't prove that, but that's what I think. So what Dr. King famously lays out in this article is his theory of direct action, which was exactly ACT UP's, and it's very effective. You start out, you are the expert on the issue. You study the issue and you come up with a solution, like with the FDA, for example. You present your solution, which has to be reasonable, winnable, and doable. Your solution cannot be socialist revolution now. That's not going to be the solution.
Right.
Okay, something that you can actually win. You present it to the powers that be. When they say no, you do what Dr. King called self-purification, or ACT UP called nonviolent civil disobedience training. And you prepare to do a theatrical kind of nonviolent civil disobedience that communicates to the public through the media to convey that you have the solution to this problem. And that is what we did, and that is what he did. So for example, the most famous direct action in American history is in the 1960s when Black students sat in at segregated lunch counter. Now that image, everyone has seen it, right? It's, it's young students, they're sitting in at a counter that says whites only, and then the racists come and smash food all over them and beat them up and all of that. They didn't just march in front with signs saying desegregate this lunch counter. They did have a picket outside, but they went in and sat at the counter, so they created an image of the world they were trying to create. And that is what direct action is. And that's why you have to be creative when you create it. One of the biggest problems on the left is that people do a tactic that doesn't work, and then they do it again, even though it never worked the first time. So things like standing in the rain passively at a demonstration, listening to speeches for hours, that doesn't work. And yet we do it over and over and over again. So that's what I would say. You identify an issue that's local to you, but maybe emblematic of a larger problem. You design a solution that's winnable. You present it to the powers that be. When they say no, you do nonviolent, theatrical, civil disobedience that in some way conveys visually to the public through the media what your solution is. And also ACT UP had a very elaborate system of legal support, of marshals, of lawyers. I interviewed lawyers. I interviewed this one lawyer, Lori Cohen, who had 10,000 cases in ACT UP. And everybody worked for free. And that was National Lawyers Guild, it was Black Lawyer Legal Defense, it's social justice lawyers. And you have to do the logistics and you have to be organized. We had people when people were being arrested, there would be legal support people saying, what's your name? So that nobody got lost in the system. And if you do your logistics, and then it's easier to be brave because there's a support structure and a community there.
I want to ask this other question online because it might feed off of that. I don't know. How do you think social media would have changed ACT UP's methods and successes?
There's pros and cons. For example, I'm a very strong supporter of Palestine and Palestine liberation. And if it wasn't for social media, I wouldn't know anything. Because if I depended on MSNBC and the New York Times and NPR, I wouldn't know anything. So it's only because of Twitter and the internet that I know things. On the other hand, when you're building, to be very deep, relationships heal. Healing takes place in relationships. And movements, there's the experience of being together in real life and going through things with people and seeing what other people's lives are like. And in those processes, you come up with ideas. And the internet does that to an extent, but not in this very deep way. And ACT UP people spent all their time in ACT UP. They were very committed and they went to jail together. And when people died, it was ACT UP people who were around them. And in those many, many days and hours and years, they came up with incredible ideas by hanging out together and talking to each other. And you really need that. Yeah.
This is a personal comment. I always wanted to tell someone from ACT UP how much of an impact you had on me. I was a 9-year-old living in rural Missouri. I was reading the coverage of the die-in in Time magazine, I think. And I looked at the photos and I was just like, these are my people. So then I was like, oh, this homosexuality thing seems to be big. Being in this article. So I looked it up in the dictionary and I was like, you know what, that's me.
Well, probably that photographer was probably like someone like Donna Binder or one of the ACT UP photojournalists who got those photos in the mainstream media. Every component of this was represented in the movement. So I'm really happy to hear that. Or the person at Time magazine, the closeted gay person who got that photo in.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I've always thought about it.
thank you. Any other thoughts?
Questions, comments?
Yes.
Can you expand a little bit more about why you think nonviolent tactics were so important and effective for ACT UP?
It's not for ideological reasons, like I'm not a pacifist. It's just that I think it's practical. Because once you become violent, they can kill you anyway, we already know that. it's not really what you do that makes them violent, but once you're violent, then the chances of that are different. I just think it's a higher ground tactic that I think the public does respond to, and I think people feel better about being part of it. I'm not saying that I would oppose people being violent necessarily, but ACT UP never committed an act of violence. And it's interesting because so many people died. They could have killed people who ran pharmaceutical companies because they were going to die, but they didn't. And people from ACT UP were beaten up by the police, and we never, not once, committed an act of violence. But also in those days, gay people weren't violent. I mean, straight people would come into the village and beat up gay people. The gay people maybe would hurt each other, but they were not violent. Because it was an oppressed minority in a different way, and the culture, gay culture was different. Yeah.
So I was in Eric C. Watt's panel on Asians' presence during the AIDS pandemic, and I was just skimming the part talking about Asian gay males' presence in ACT UP, but I'm wondering would you have anything to say?
Oh, sure. So you're talking about Love Your Asian Body by
Yes.
Eric Watt. It's a great book about Asian AIDS activism in Los Angeles. Highly recommend. So there was an Asian Pacific Islander group inside ACT UP, and I have a chapter on the work that they did. And they did all kinds of things. They did stuff in Chinatown. They did stuff in Asian gay bars. They put window installations in Asian neighborhoods. They got AIDS information translated into 8 Asian languages. They just did a huge amount of work. And this was a typical ACT UP thing, that there'd be a group of people who understood something, and they would do the work that needed to be done. Yeah. Sure. Yes.
I'm wondering, since this book has come out and you've had time to interact with a lot of people about it, are there any things that you're seeing in terms of organizing on any subject whatsoever that you feel like might be sort of getting anything right?
I think there's organizing going on everywhere, but I think that one of the things that we don't have is a left-wing press. And so we don't know what's going on. So if there was because the problem is you can't make money from an oppositional press. And the people who made all these feminist and gay newspapers, they did it for free. But if there was a website where I could go every day and I could find out what demonstrations happened in every city in this country and who the different organizers were, what were the names of the organizations, and what were their demands, that would help us. Because there's movements like the anti-police violence movement, the anti-eviction movement, right? Immigration reform. I mean, there's things that are everywhere in the country. Stuff for homeless people. I mean, the whole country's falling apart, right? And people are responding everywhere. It's just that we don't have the coherent information. And it's very hard to write a history of a social movement because there is so little documentation by the corporate media. In ACT UP's case, one of the reasons that things were documented was because the camcorder was invented right at the beginning of AIDS. So it was the first movement where people could just have a little video camera. Video used to be this big thing where you had to carry this deck that was the size of a suitcase, and another person had to hold a boom mic. But when they made the camcorder, then we had video activism, which ACT UP was the first movement that had that. And it's really interesting to compare corporate news' visual coverage of AIDS activism or ACT UP with our own media, because they only showed white men. Because they were white men. So they would go to a demonstration, they would put footage of all white men, and they would only interview white men. You look at our media and you see all these different people talking, so the contrast, you can really see how distorted the representation was. So if we had, somebody could pull that together, it would be very, very helpful. Yeah. Yes.
So we hear a lot about police infiltration, especially throughout the 1980s and early 90s and other movements, but I don't hear much about them in the time of ACT UP. Did you have any examples?
It's at the back of my book. There's an appendix at the back of my book, which I got the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, filed, the FBI and New York Police Department files of ACT UP. ACT UP was heavily infiltrated. The files are so redacted, which means that if they get the information from an informant, they black it out. And it's pages and pages and pages of blacked out stuff. It's so blacked out that even someone like me who knows so much about ACT UP, I can't figure out who the infiltrators were. At one point, Barney Frank, who was a gay congressman from Massachusetts, wrote to the FBI and said, look, we know you have infiltrators in ACT UP. Are they FBI agents who are pretending to be us? Or are they us who got arrested for drugs or something who are giving you information? And I reproduced the answer letter from the FBI and I can't tell what he's saying. So that to me tells me that it's both, but I don't know.
I think we have time for,
This is not J. Edgar, this is after him.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
that's okay.
we have time for maybe one more question.
Oh, okay.
And then signing.
Yeah, and one more question, one last question.
I've got one on here. If there's
Okay.
somebody, someone was asking what you thought about regarding the media, Democracy Now, asking, do you think it's a left-wing source?
I love Democracy Now. I love Amy Goodman, my favorite American. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, so I know we got a lot of people here and some chairs in the way, and if you want to get books signed, let's make a line that kind of goes straight back and through that other door. Then people who need to get this way can get that way.
I'm gonna go to the bathroom before I go. Are you headed home?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was really fun to hang out. Do it again soon.
We can talk about the
Yeah, for sure.
Good to see you.
Yeah, she said she's new. Wow.
You're back from Texas, or?
From Texas, yeah. Yes. Texas newborn.
Yeah,
Which
so
I wish I could
nice.
have posted pictures of.
So nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I know Sarah from New York in the 90s.
Oh, that's incredible. I'm not surprised to see you here.
Yeah.
I would love to.
And
talk to
I
you
went to
more
her
about-
conversation today. She had a conversation with friends.
Oh, she did. Oh, that's so cool. I didn't know. Well, I'm gonna buy a book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are the books for sale up here?
I think they were here at the
Okay.
I'll do that. I'll buy that.
A very old.
There's somebody, who's down the front row who left their bag here.
What is this other one? Thank you so much. Very interesting. My dad was part of that wave. Or is it? Yeah. Very interesting.
I like your shirt.
Oh, this is like.
Oh, no.
I was just here.
Are you
I'm like,
live? I am. Okay, now I will.
You're in line. Yeah, okay.
trap people with one movement.
Hi, do you want to be one of our personalized? Yes. I'll check 3 different names. This one is Ellie, L-L-I. There you go. The next one.
Different ways of linking races.
Right, right.
Thank you.
I'll give it time to my dad.
Oh, Mike. Like the one family member that I don't know. I know him, but I don't know his name offhand. Wonderful. E-S-E-I-L-E-N.
Yes, very good, very good. I know we've been Facebook friends for a while.
We have a long time. Yeah.
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 I'm gonna say goodbye and I'm gonna head out.
All right.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
You're just gonna relay then.
But I will. Yes, can I come coincide with luncheon?
Yeah, so it's literally.
That would be
But I opened it, this one, check this out.
Right.
Also,
Celebrate
yeah.
on their own way.
I love me as
But it wasn't sure she had your access.
No, that's something. I think
So we were, Whitney and all these different institutions celebrating them. So
Like, okay, if you're looking for.
yes, it's amazing. So I'm a film credit about.
You can
that person green.
Main Street, museum,
But what I do is I just pop
and I was just,
around.
if you don't have time, it's great, but I was just wondering.
Margaret Phillips has all these.
I was like, I'm not sure. I was
You gotta help.
Don't have.
So like
You'll
the.
get them on the stage pretty.
Yeah.
Yes.
You could.
I was telling you that you
Oh my God, I'm reading about it now. Oh, wow.
But also the
Oh, I'm so, I did it. I'm actually, this is freaking out. I'm actually writing about it right now. I'm making sure you. Yeah, all right, thank you so much. All right.
Before that, they were all like people from the 80s. So these are the cooperate with law enforcement and contacting the National Lawyers.
Yeah, there was.
FBI. Oh, this is a cute one.
Yeah, there was.
So I actually have an appointment on Friday in at the zoo for 5 hours. Oh, not Mizzou. Like, okay, I was about to say.
So,
I always looking for, where's the last copy? It was never where it should have been.
our
And then they were like,
analysis.
That is what they requested. Yes.
So,
Also,
I asked them, I requested for the State Historical Society to hold a so I'm very excited about
Same thing for that one.
But they told me that 9 of the boxes I want are actually
but I will.
at Columbia.
At least.
They have to bring them in on the day. So I'm disappointed I won't be able to see them as much as I want. By the way, I'm going to be seeing a lot of activists.
Yeah, I don't know, I feel like every couple of years.
Can we add some stuff?
Yes.
I just want to say that's fabulous. Thank you. Sure was.
Oh, that's cool. That's the classic autograph
Okay.
style.
Oh my God.
You can put it in.
No, it's my great pleasure. Thank you. It's a long one. It takes a while. I read at it. I have gone through these old slides and you know, it's like totally. I never, why do I make notes about it right now? Well, you probably know a lot of people.
Yeah.
I might, I mean, I do know some, but you know, New York, I mean, of course I know some.
Right.
That's just,
Yeah.
this is like.
Yeah.
That's the talk. I think and you sound, you know, like the musicians that have the one song every day. True story.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so, have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you so much. Sure.
These ones for certain.
Okay.
Exciting.
Oh, right.
See you
By
later.
this back, I might.
Eileen is here.
No, I have to just get this beautiful stack of books. Yeah.
Praising you as you walk right up behind me.
I've had the honor of, well, not only reading here, but even I hosted a thing once when my friend, the memoirist, came to LA. We had it. This is now going back a few years. Her memoir was about having a brain aneurysm and losing her language completely, like total aphasia, like a complete. No. I know that book. Shoot, okay, my memory is not so great.
Grandma.
Yeah, I never. Hold on, I'm gonna. This is awful. She was my neighbor in Altadena, California. It's called A Stitch in Time, so I remember the name of the book. So now I'm gonna look it up.
We have a late breaking.
Oh, yeah, great.
Can I ask you a question? What's your name? Carmen. Carmen, and then